Good afternoon, and welcome to F5's panel, Guru panel on Shellshock. My name is Preston Hogue, and I'm the Director of Security Marketing and Architecture at F5. And I'm here today with an excellent group of panelists to go over the topic of Shellshock, which I know is very important to each of you. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Jeff Costlow. Jeff?
My name is Jeff Costlow. I run a product development group called the Platform Security Group, and we do vulnerability response and security work on the BigIP platform itself.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And Sam, I know you also are on Jeff's team. Can you give a little bit of background about yourself as well?
Yeah, I'm a senior security test engineer here on Jeff's team, and everything from security research to pen testing to you name it. If it's got to do with security, we do it.
Awesome, glad to have you guys. All right, also last but definitely not least, Joe Pruitt.
Hey, how you doing? I'm Joe Pruitt. I'm a senior strategic architect here at F5. I work in the digital marketing team, mainly working with our customers on extensibility features of our products, and I'm deeply involved with Dev Central, our developer community.
Thank you. And once again, my name is Preston Hogue. And we're going to go ahead and dive into the topic, of course, on Shellshock. And first and foremost, we'd like to allow everyone to know that we are taking in questions via the chat session. And after we dive into the topic for about 20 minutes, we're going to go ahead and transition over to each of you. So please ask us any of those important questions that you're looking to get addressed. So let's go ahead and dive right into the detail of what is Shellshock. Jeff?
So a shell is a program that we use to communicate. A lot of times we do command line interaction with the computer. A shell takes care of a lot of the little details that you need to do, like path searching and file globbing. It's a useful little construct that we use as an intermediary between a human and the computer. The shell also does things like execute commands for you. It's a very, very nice and convenient feature. At some point in time, we added the ability to have these nice, convenient functions intermediate between one program that tries to start another program. Interprocess intermediation is what Bash does a lot of. It turns out that this Bash can execute code out of its environment. And the environment is, think of it as like a scratch space in your programming language. You store variables there, you store information there. Turns out you can also store functions and Bash commands inside that area. And so Shellshock is essentially the ability for somebody to take untrusted input that contains a function or contains executable code, pass that through your web server, and then on its way to whatever back-end process that you've got, it ends up executing that code there. It's a very dangerous, thing to have happen.
Thank you, Jeff. Joe, do you have anything to add on to that? I mean, how big of an impact, what versions of Bash is this impacting, for instance?
Well, from what we know, this has been almost 20 years out in the wild. And so think about your home routers are running a version of Unix. How many systems are on the network? How many systems you've got, legacy systems that are laying around? What's exposed? It's out there. It's all over the place. And what's scary about this, as opposed to some of the previous exploits we've seen, is that this allows remote code execution on the systems. And just the mere fact that there are so many of these all over the place with 20 years of versions of these of Bash on them, it's really scary. It really is.
Wow. So what exploits have we been seeing in the wild? Sam, do you want to elaborate there?
Yes. So one of the things that when something like this comes up, we've got a lot of different ways to monitor. Social media. I mean, our own research and all that. And so we are seeing out there in the wild everything from botnets to let me just back up here. It's real easy to test for this by just changing a user agent to testing like a web CGI. So we're seeing, like I said, people with botnets going and doing some very malicious things, all the way down to just people changing their user agent string and scanning the internet and then doing that. And so that's what makes this, it makes it very, very dangerous.
Very dangerous because user agent typically isn't used by backend applications. So you can create your own new headers to pass these values in. So your applications can still be performing as they would be expected, but piggybacking these commands across random headers.
Yeah, and that's
and I will point out that this code is executing inside of your firewall, right?
Yeah.
You've got your firewall or your application firewall protecting your applications, but the code is actually executing on your application server.
Yeah,
Wow.
and just to add a little bit to that, what makes it so with you have a program and you can do all the input sanitation you want on like a bash shell script if you're using it in CGI, but since it's passing it into the environment and it's executing that environment, all that input sanitation you did, it just doesn't help.
It's like giving root access, administrator access to your systems to anybody, right?
So,
There's-
so from what we can gather so far is that this exploit itself is very broad, and
Yeah.
very, it's been out there for, like we've been talking about, at least 20 years for some of the operating systems that are out there. And it also sounds like the ease of exploit and the risk is very, very large. So now that we've talked about the actual exploit itself, the vulnerability, let's talk specifically about what we know that our listeners are very, very interested in understanding. What is the impact itself to F5's BigIP platforms, Jeff?
Right. So F5 platforms, we do have bash on our system. We are working up a patch right now. At this point in time, we know of no remote exploits. The only exploit we know of is against our web GUI, and you need to be authenticated in order to get to it. So it is our recommendation at this point in time that you keep your management port, and this has always been our recommendation, you keep your management port isolated onto a network that you consider safe, that no one can access from the outside world or from the internet.
Self IPs as well.
Self IPs as well, that's a really important point. It is possible, and we've got we've made our defaults much better. We've made our defaults good so that you do not have a virtual or a self IP exposed to the internet by default. However, you can turn on port 443 on any self IP and it will come in. Certainly don't do that on your internet-facing self IPs.
Thank you. So specifically, there's a vulnerability on the management interface, and you have to be an authenticated user to be able to exploit that. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Awesome. So now that we've talked about the fact that what the exploit is, the breadth of the exploit, how it impacts overall F5's BigIP platforms, let's now start to dive into exactly what else can F5's overall platform and capabilities from our overall technology do to assist in mitigating systems that aren't F5 systems that are also vulnerable.
Sure. Well, let's start first by emphasizing the point that you should patch your systems. So network mitigation is one piece of the puzzle, but definitely take a first step to look at and trying to make sure you can isolate and inventory all of your systems that are affected, determine which ones are affected, and get patches on them. Right? That's number one. As an intermediary step, we've done some things on the network layer that you can do to mitigate the time it takes to patch all your backend systems. So we've got a couple solutions there, depending on which products you've got, and solutions that we provide. With a straight LTM fronting, BigIP LTM fronting your application servers, we've published a couple iRules, 2 versions of those, to do some simple checks to make sure that this string that comes through that is susceptible to this vulnerability is blocked from getting into your backend application. Now, I would like to emphasize the point as well that we haven't isolated all applications that have been susceptible to this, but by doing a overview, like a high-level block of HTTP headers, we can be pretty confident that if you have an HTTP application, this will somewhat mitigate those. Now, again, new exploits are coming out every day, so we're taking those in as we see them. But so we have the iRule that'll help you for your HTTP-based applications. We also have, if you are a customer using ASM or ASM Firewall, I believe this morning or yesterday we published some solutions on that, so you can import those directly in, and we'll have the blog site. I believe they do a similar pattern matching off of you may have seen the left-right parentheses and then a curly bracket. That string seems to be a identifier for this vulnerability. And then lastly, if you're using our line rate product, we've provided a line rate solution as well that inspects URI and headers coming in for your applications and performs blocking of those.
Great. Anything, Sam or Jeff, that you want to add to that?
Just that there are many, many web frameworks out there,
Yeah.
and frameworks that you use. And Joe said this already, but we don't know exactly, and nobody really knows exactly which vulnerabilities are vulnerable, or which frameworks are vulnerable. CGIs are especially vulnerable. That part is well known. How you can exploit this with Java or exploit this with whatever web framework you have on the back end is up in the air at this point in time, which means that it's good to try to get some safety in there and make sure that you get things protected.
Yeah, CGI is the one that has been documented the most, the mod CGI exploit, but there's nothing stopping you writing your own custom application that takes a header and does something system-wide with it. So it's important to patch it on your system level to begin with, patch bash on your system so that whatever frameworks are running on there won't be able to make use of that exploit. And then look at a network solution as well as an intermediary approach to help you in the longer term.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah.
Before we go ahead and transition over to the audience for additional questions, do each of you want to add any additional details? Jeff, any concerns or any other thing we want to address before we dive into the details of the questions?
So I just want to say that F5 is working furiously right now to try to get a patch out. I didn't mention that before. To get a patch out for the BigIP itself, not patching your applications like Joe's been talking about, but to patch the BigIP. Those are expected to come out sometime later this week. We're still working on that. We worked over the weekend, and we'll continue to work on that to get that out as soon as possible.
Thank you very much. All right. Let's go ahead and address our first question today. So, do you have a solution for Shellshock for LTM which does not have ASM? And I think we were just diving into that. Jeff, do you want to go ahead and handle this one?
Yeah, I think it's if you go for LTM, we've got the iRule solution that Joe posted Friday midday.
Mitigating Shellshock with BigIP iRules.
Yes,
I believe is the
and
article.
that you can get to there off f5.com/shellshock. Will take you to Joe's post and my post, and I believe they're all kind of linked together at this point in time, so you can get to any of those posts very quickly.
Yeah, so it's an iRule. You apply it to your virtuals that are fronting your back end. It inspects the URI and the header for this pattern, and if it finds it, rejects it. So my point on the iRule I'd like to make, and I put that in my article as well, if you're going to deploy this, make sure that you're monitoring the logs for auditing, because we want to know if there's false, but you may have some applications that rely on this pattern for normal traffic. So make sure that you're pretty diligent about looking at those logs for matches for false positives, because there's only so much that we know. We know the pattern, but we don't know every application that's running out there, and could be custom applications that rely on that pattern.
And false positives do seem unlikely at this point, but they're certainly not. They certainly can't be ruled out.
Yeah.
Thank you. And so a question from Paul. Is there a patch specifically for F5 running versions of 11.5.1, hotfix 3, all versions?
F5 is working as fast as we possibly can to get all our hotfixes out for all our versions. I'm not aware of the status of 11.5.1 hotfix 3 at this exact moment in time, but it is on our queue, and we'll be getting those patches out again starting later this week.
And as a short-term mitigation, make sure that your management port and self IPs are not on the public network. Make sure they're in a protected area. If they're in a protected area, you're as secure as your network is. And if you're confident as your network being secure, then the risk on our product is minimal.
It's important to point out that the only known exploit against the BigIPs of the management port, not through the traffic passing through it, is behind the authentication. So you have to be authenticated to get there. And so that limits our exposure to your authenticated users to this issue. But we will be patching it, like I've said, as soon as possible to make sure that all our customers are safe.
Yeah, that's an important point. You have to be authenticated to get in to begin with. So
it's an important mitigation point.
Thank you. And so transitioning once again away from vulnerabilities to the platform itself, to mitigating systems behind ours. We've got a question from Michael Laney. How vulnerable are the nodes sitting behind the F5, especially when they are using SSL? Go ahead and pass this one back over to you, Joe.
I don't think SSL has anything to do with this since it's part of the payload that's passed through. So having SSL on your servers won't protect you, as far as I'm aware, because that's just an encryption layer on top of the data that's being passed through to begin with. So SSL is a good thing. I think it's important to protect the integrity for man-in-the-middle attacks and that kind of thing. But this specific exploit is client passing data through back into your application, the backend application interpreting it incorrectly, taking it and doing something malicious with it that it didn't intend to.
Which is also why it's very important to be able to have a platform that can terminate SSL and do the overall inspection of that SSL, as we're talking about when this iRule and applying that iRule, and a platform such as F5 that can handle the very high demand around SSL, of course, could be leveraged.
That's a good point. Without terminating in the middle, your application firewall cannot tell if the vulnerability is trying to make its way in, right?
True.
Exactly, and you'll be blind to the attack.
Yeah.
So moving on to the next question, I ran some tests based on Dev Central's Shellshock mitigation using ASM signatures and couldn't run any shell commands. Albeit this is after I patched bash on the nodes behind
Good.
the F5.
Yeah.
I would take it.
Yeah.
The question has a ... So
Yeah.
you,
I think that's a good thing. It's hard to tell from that question whether the
Right.
ASM blocked it. Were you able to look in your ASM logs, see if they trapped them, see if there's any captures of those going on, and patching your backend system is definitely good. So.
Yes, that is one of the most important mitigations, is to get the bash patched on all your backend servers, just to make sure. It's a good idea to have ASM in front of it, or whatever iRules in front of it, because you never know when you're going to bring up a new system that had the old version of bash. Or
Well, they're also in the middle of they've released several patches for this, right? So.
there has been some confusion about that. We should
Yeah.
probably address that right now. There has been some confusion. Red Hat, who has kind of been somewhat the unofficial leader of this whole bash thing, they released some patches on Thursday evening, and then there was a lot of confusion about, there happens to be CVE 2014 6271, 7169, 7187, 7186, and then 6722. Terrible that I remember all those. But these have all come up. This has been my weekend. These have all come up in the last few days. The information that I have right now is that the patch that was released Thursday night contains all of those fixes. I'm not going to guarantee that that's all the fixes that are in this bash, but F5 is moving ahead with those particular patches, and those are under test right now, and I've already said that we're working furiously to get these out the door soon.
Yeah, and as a customer, I'd recommend staying on top of this, following the patches,
Right.
and if there are future ones that are pushed out, patching and repatching. Keep this until we've got some validation that all these holes are.
Due to the pervasive nature of bash and the fact that it's everywhere, this is likely to be not well understood, the depths of how often this can be exploited. And so we're going to keep your eyes peeled and keep all your patches up to date as much as you can.
Yep.
So an interesting question here from Lauren Hudson. Hopefully we'll be able to respond to it. What is the possibility that the patch you'll be providing breaking IAPs such as VMware View dynamic session detections? So I'm not exactly clear specifically what she's trying to ask there. I think potentially is, will the patch break iRule or IAPs, such as the VMware View dynamic session detection?
That seems very unlikely. Due to the nature of the patch, it disallows executing commands from the environment. And so we don't know of any false positives that will break any particular feature of the F5 box. It seems very unlikely. That's one of the things that we're going through right now, is going through all our automated testing routines to make sure that we haven't broken anything with these builds.
Yeah, and just to add to that, so we have a very extensive testing framework for testing our builds and all that with regression testing. So hopefully something like that would catch that. I mean, it takes a while. That's one of the reasons it's taking us a little while to get these patches out. We'd love to just pop one out with that night, but we got to make sure and do our due diligence to make sure we don't break anything else.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And so the next question here is from Graham. Can the F5 LTM product alone realistically keep up with these threats? iRules provide a short to medium term workaround, and ASM at times can appear complex and cumbersome to implement on existing services. Would we ever see an ASM Lite dealing with high visibility negative security threats? So, Sam?
Sounds like a good idea. I don't really know how to answer this one other than, yes, ASM can be really complex. That's whenever you have a very powerful, feature that can protect against a lot of different security threats, it gets inherently complex. The iRules, a little bit more simpler, but like I said, they can be short term depending on what type of performance you're looking at. An ASM Lite, that sounds like an interesting idea that maybe we should look into. I don't know.
Jeff, do you have anything else to add on that, or Joe?
Go ahead. You're about to say something.
No, I think the ability to apply iRules in this programmatic way dynamically really actually adds a lot of value. If tomorrow we discovered that there was a new syntax for bash, we would be able to update right away for that. We don't believe that's true right now, but we certainly should be able to do that. ASM.
Yeah, and I just want to add on the fact of iRules is it is a programmable language, right? And it's when you're under a 0 day, having something is complex, but also is dynamic as iRules are very important. I mean, we've seen this before in the SSL renegotiation. We saw this just recently with Heartbleed. And now, once again, we're sitting in front of you discussing another option for programmability. And not only programmability within iRules, but now we're also talking about line rate. And then additionally, having the ability to adapt a signature on the fly with ASM. So in this instance, we had 3 different dynamic ways contextually to be able to block this. The key thing is that we always know, longer term wise, we may not want to keep an iRule. That's a short-term type of fix, just as we did with SSL renegotiation and many of the other iRules. As we need to migrate those types of features into the overall platform, we will do so. But we all know during a 0 day, it's pretty awesome to have this type of programmability.
Yeah, and we don't know. There could be some backend applications that don't have a patch available for it. The build of whatever build of Unix that it's running, something custom, you don't have a unique build for that. So there may be a long-term need for ASM or LTM to protect that system if it's needed in your environment.
A classic example. A classic example of that is Internet of Things and all these embedded devices that we keep building, right? They very well have old platforms on, or old versions of software with Bash, and maybe you don't have a firmware update for your light bulb that is web connected, and so
there's an article about that.
Yes, I'm making reference to, there was a headline that said hackers will attack you through your light bulb, which I think is a little bit hyperbolic, but it can be true. It can be true.
It can.
Great. And so next question here: do we know if Shellshock allows privilege escalation, or would it only execute in the security context of the user running the bash session?
So generally speaking, again, this has a lot to do with web frameworks and what you might be using on your back end, but generally speaking, Apache runs as a non-privileged user. So he doesn't always have access to all the system files. He can't necessarily do a root shell and give you full permission to the box, but he may be able to invoke what we call a reverse shell, which is giving a shell back to somebody on the outside. And once they do that, then they can execute commands as the Apache user. Again, Apache is somewhat unprivileged. He doesn't have full root level privileges on the box. They might be able to escalate their privileges. There are a fair number of vulnerabilities that will allow somebody who is an unprivileged user to raise their escalation level until they escalate their privileges, and then they can do something a little more damaging than the Apache user could do.
You can also use that normal user to get access, pulling the password file, looking at valid users on the system to get information knowledge as well, maybe not, but to give them a step into the door as well. Right?
It's similar. You could use it similar to Heartbleed, which was an information leak. It's important to note that there's different classes of vulnerabilities here. Heartbleed, which was the last one we spoke about, which was also a large issue, Heartbleed allowed an attacker to gain information about the inner workings of the server, and they could gain a lot of information. They could gain passwords, they could gain server keys, they could gain important information. This is actually a privilege escalation, a remote code execution, possibly followed by privilege escalation, and that allows them to get at least some of these forms of information, not all the same. It's unlikely that they'd be able to get the your web server keys, but I'm not going to make any claims on that right now too deeply. The remote code execution is very dangerous.
Yeah, and getting to back to the question about do we know what security context? We don't know, because we don't know how all the applications were configured. You could escalate your CGI app to be full full access. So, and then the context that it's run in. So we can't say it. It depends on how you've configured your applications on the back end. You just don't know.
Yeah, and the key thing is once you take over the web server,
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, you have a much higher degree of a possibility of getting escalation of privileges just due to the fact that at that point in time, you own the web server. So web server, of course, has access to the application server. Application server has access to the database server. So
Yeah,
any which way you look at it, it doesn't introduce any form of goodness, to say the least.
I've read examples of folks injecting their own web servers on the system to listen to alternate ports, and it's crazy what you can do. It's really scary.
Great. So, question from Mike D. Or sorry, let's go ahead to Sammy. Does this affect APM webtops which are available publicly? Can anyone address that?
Have you investigated that yet?
Yeah. We're starting to, not to my knowledge, we haven't found anything that allows, that will shell out like that calls bash, and as we know, when you're looking at this, it's not just, it's whether or not you're doing system, pop-up and calls, those type of things. And so we're doing a complete audit just to make sure, but we don't know of any, and we haven't found any yet.
Thank you
But
very
we're
much,
working
Sam.
around the clock to make sure.
That's a good question, by the way.
Yeah.
This is something that is inherent in the BigIP, and it will be available publicly, again, to authenticated users, but you may not trust those users as much as you trust your management port users.
That's a good point,
So
yeah.
it's a very good point. Very good question.
Great. And so, diving back into the mitigation capabilities. So I have 1,200 VIPs and no ASM. Is there something that you guys would suggest? So right back to the mitigation options that we've been discussing. Joe, do you want to?
Firewall is completely viable for if you have no ASM. And if you look at the second iRule I posted that just does a straight pattern check across all of your header and request content, the impact is pretty small and 1,200 VIPs is actually not a very, very large configuration for some of our customers are using. So.
Thank you. And for some of you who may have joined late, f5.com/Shellshock, you will be able to find all the additional information associated with the different elements of mitigation for line rate, for ASM, and for iRules, as we've been discussing today. We encourage you to take a look at that particular site as we're going through this discussion because it has a lot of additional information for you as well. So let's go ahead and dive into another question here. So do we know if Shellshock allows privilege escalation or would it only execute in the security context of user bash? I believe that we answered that question already.
Yeah.
So let's see here. Let's go to the next question. How does this vulnerability affect VIP in back-end servers? So I believe that we've addressed that as well. If essentially those servers in themselves are vulnerable, we know that we can leverage F5 as a device that can provide those level of mitigation, of course, assuming that we're in front of them. But of course, Sam, do you want to?
The only thing to add, throwing on my security hat is use the iRule to mitigate, from the external, but that shouldn't stop you from patching your bash on your backend servers. Attacks always come from the inside, so use that as a stopgap to make sure that to reduce your risk and exposure. But use that time to definitely update your bash in any of your backend servers.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
And the only other thing to add to that, following some of the research, if anybody's out there is using Troots or anything like that, a lot of times you copy bash in there. So just even updating onto your system.
You want to tell everybody what a Troot is?
Yeah, good question. So a trooted environment. Okay. So in a trooted environment, basically you're taking a system and you're making a smaller system to where that runs as a less privileged user, and so you'll run like Apache or a web server in that environment. And so the idea is that if an exploit happens, somebody gets shell on that, you're inside of this little jailed area. Now there are escapes on that, but we're not going to really go into that. But that kind of mitigates that type of thing. But to make that run, you actually have to create a full environment in that root. So a lot of times people will copy bash or different shells into that little environment. Now if you just update your system, you may not be updating into that root environment, leaving yourself vulnerable. It's just one thing to think about when you're going to patch your backend systems is how did you design it? Where all do you need to update your bash?
Very good point.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I've always thought Troot being very secure type of environment, and it goes to show that something as large as bash impacts everything.
Yes.
So very, very broad impacting vulnerability. So Andrew has a question here. From Andrew, I'm missing something. How do you apply an iRule to multiple or all virtuals? I can't apply them at one time. I can't apply them all at one time. Joe or Jeff, do you want to take this? Applying an iRoll to.
Go ahead, Joe.
Well, through the API or through the management interface, that's true. But we have APIs. You could automate this pretty easily with using iControl with either our REST or our SOAP interfaces. Yeah, that's a good point. Maybe I'll push out some code samples that'll allow you to mass push this to all your VIPs. It's actually very easy. I think you can do it in one API call. But you're right, that is a limitation on our user interface. Another option is, if you're a power user, go and edit the config file directly and mass change that way and reload. Somewhat risky that way. You want to make sure that you're very careful and you test it out. But there are several ways to do it, but you're right, the user interface, it is a little bit cumbersome to change thousands of virtuals.
I would come back to the programmability on that one. Is you essentially just said use the interface that we supply in order to change all these virtual servers. 1,200 is a decently large number. You don't want to go VI the edit on that. But,
it would, I got you, but
the scalability then, the scalability is the next point, to say that we do have the scalability to handle all 1,200 of those VIPs, even with those iRules, presumably.
Scalability, absolutely, but the physical act of applying the iRule to all of those servers. So I'll take that as an action, and I'll put a post out here with some sample code to do that. That's a good
not
idea.
to overlook
Good
the very valuable offer that Joe had just made, and we'll all be looking forward to that post that will be coming up later on, once again, f5.com /Shellshock. So let's go ahead, and I got another question here from the audience. Is there any system performance issues for iRule usage? And of course, there's always going to be some form of performance when you apply an iRule, but we all know there's always risk versus reward. And so let's talk about what is the risk versus reward on applying this iRule. I know there's different versions that are available out there. Joe, do you want to go ahead and talk about the various different options that exist within the iRule and some of the performance impacts that we may have?
Sure, yeah. We have customers that are doing pretty detailed or pretty complicated iRules in their systems. I'll say this, and I always talk when I talk to customers, adding on features to the data path will slow things down. Now, the question is how much. The second iRule that I published that took into account a little bit of performance, taking all of the requests and just doing, you limit the amount of auditing you can do in detail about which headers and those things that come in. But that one is doing a single string comparison against your request. So the effect is very minimal. We're talking sub-millisecond for that operation on our platform. So the impact is very, very small. If you think that you're vulnerable on your back ends, applying this on the front is a very good idea. Also look at your systems. If you're running at 99% utilization, you have to be, it's part of capacity planning and planning on these things. But I'm pretty confident. We haven't done detailed performance on the iRule because we were kind of rushing to get it out as quick as possible. But we've had feedback, and customers have been successful with blocking exploit attempts with it already. So I wouldn't be overly concerned, but as you apply it, definitely monitor your system, look at the utilization and how things are going. But the impact is very small, and the risk is pretty high.
Yeah, thank you, Joe.
Yeah.
So just to kind of reiterate there is that, as Joe mentioned, that the impact is very minimal, milliseconds. For being able to block this, but once again, what is a
microseconds?
Or microseconds even. What is a microsecond when ultimately that you are blocking an exploit that could have remote execution? And so we really believe that the risk versus reward is balanced with this. But as Joe iterated, or just to reiterate, is just also make sure that you understand the overall capacity of your system and what other how much capacity are you already leveraging, right? So that's going to be very critical. So another important question that someone asked was, is this video going to be available after the fact? And absolutely, once again, on f5.com /Shellshock, you will be able to watch this video. We're going to have to go through post-production, of course. Everyone that's watching it live is able to get the most current information, but we will be posting this after the fact, so everyone can go back and re-listen to all the valuable questions. In addition, we will also be taking each of the questions and documenting them on the f5.com Shellshock site as well, so you can go back and look specifically for the types of questions that you are most important and most pertinent to you. So back to our questions for the overall audience. Will the iRule work on older versions like OS 9 and 10? So, or version, sorry, it says up there OS. So version 9 or version 10, are there any restrictions that we currently have within the iRule?
Gosh, I'm gonna have to look back at when the first iRule, I believe, will work back to version 9, those HTTP header commands. I'm gonna have to look back at the HTTP request command when we optimized pulling the whole request in. Fairly confident that's gonna be 10 and above, but I'll put back on the show notes here the specific version that is compatible with. Or you can go, if you want to go check right now, before I can go back and document it, go up to the Dev Central Wiki, look for the HTTP request command on there, and it'll tell you which version that method was introduced into.
Excellent. That's an excellent question from the audience on the versioning, because obviously very important for those individuals running the version 9, and for those that don't have time to be able to look up that version. As Joe stated, we will be updating that before the end of the day and making sure that everyone is aware of the versions associated to the iRules that we have currently posted. So thank you very much for that particular question. So moving on to the next question, what about GTM? Do we need to add iRules there, or will the LTM take care of it? Jeff, I mean,
I don't know of any vulnerabilities against GTM. The GTM protocol is a binary protocol, and queries, to my knowledge, do not invoke bash. I think it's unlikely that there are any exploit vectors through GTM or through DNS, but that kind of seems, that's about all the information I have right now.
wonderful. But of course, we are continuing to be diligent and looking at every single version of ours, and we will once again be updating any additional vulnerabilities or exploits that we identify, because I know that you as a team are constantly focused on ensuring that we look at every single vector, every single avenue possible. So once again, just stay current on the page, because this is an ever-evolving overall vulnerability. We've all seen from last week to this week, the amount of exploits that have already been posted, and we expect to see, many new exploits. So we are going to continue to stay on top of it, and we just encourage all of you to stay on top of our overall communication, because we will, as stated, we will continually update you on any new occurrences that we see associated with this overall vulnerability. So moving on to the next question, if I have GTM plus LTM on my external network, is there any issues with iQuery? And I think that goes back to what you just stated, Jeff, right? Which is, at this point in time, we do not believe that there are any vulnerabilities associated with iQuery. But as stated, we will continue to do our diligence and validate that all of our platforms and the associated versions are protected. And if they're not, as stated, we will update you immediately as we identify those, as we continually do more security assessments on all of our platforms. Next question. Is TMSH shell affected by Shellshock vulnerability? This is an excellent question. You want to, Sam, you want to go ahead and address this one?
Sure. Sorry, I'm trying to think the best way to answer this. The answer is no, but depending on how you're running it, because TMS shell, for those who don't know what the TMSH is, it's basically a replacement for a shell. It's a restricted shell, but there are areas, like if you're running it as an admin, that you can then execute bash. Right. So this was actually one of the first things I looked at when this came out, was like, is there a way for us to export environment variables when you're calling bash? And we haven't, to our knowledge, found a way to do that yet. But when you're running as admin and you can call a vulnerable version of bash, like I said, I don't know of any. But
to point out, though, in order for you to run a bash command, you have to actually be an administrator on the box in the first place. So you have to A, be authenticated,
good point,
B, have a role of administrator on the box, because we don't allow anybody less than administrator to execute bash commands for safety, to isolate them down.
And so like one of the first tests I did was took a look at TMSH as like a guest user, as restricted, and we're not exporting any variables, we're calling bash out on any of those. So at that point, there was no attack vectors that I was able to find. And so I feel pretty confident about that. Like I said, we're continuing to hammer at this as new information comes out about the different attack vectors. Like I said, the first patch, it was very specific, and they came out and said, okay, this wasn't good enough. That's why we're including all the different CVE patches into this, and then constantly retesting our platform.
Awesome. But just to reiterate for all of you listening out there is that essentially is that TMSH is a proprietary version of our own shell, and it does actually have access specifically to bash,
Yes.
but you have to have administrative privileges to begin with. So ultimately, you have to already be on the system as an authenticated user. You have to be an administrator authenticated user, and then there's a potential, but once again, as you stated, we've done our diligence, and we believe at this point in time that we don't think that we can be exploited through this avenue.
Right.
At the same time, we are continuing to look through that avenue to validate. So moving on to the next question from David, would the iHealth diagnostics help with analysis for Shellshock? This is an excellent question. So
That's one of the first things. Over the years, all my years at F5, we've developed what I call a crisis procedure. And one of the first things that we have in that procedure is to start to document on Ask F5 and create a solution, as well as to create a heuristic on iHealth. I don't know the status of that right now, but that is one of the things that I requested right away, was to get an iHealth heuristic, so that if iHealth runs on your box, I don't believe it's going to have access to run bash to see if it can have the exploit in it, but it will know what version of bash you have based on the RPM version, because I believe we send essentially a bill of materials for what we have on the box. So we will know when you have a vulnerable version of bash on your box, and iHealth can warn you. I don't know the state of that right now, but that should be coming fairly soon over the course of the next week. It's still very early in this vulnerability.
thank you. And to reiterate, once again, you can find the solution article on askf5.com, or once again, you can find it by going to f5.com/Shellshock. And all of that information in one central location is available to you, listing out the current versions that are vulnerable to the bash. But once again, anything else that will be updated on that solution page as well as we learn more information. Yeah. So another question here from JC, wondering if APM collects context-specific information, including HTTP header, and processes them before calling out the credential validation, and whether bash is used to process that information. Quick response will be greatly appreciated. Let's just go ahead and reiterate that question. Wondering if APM collects context-based specific information, including HTTP header, and processes them before calling out for credential validation, and whether bash is used to process that information.
So I'll take that one. Right now, I don't know the answer to that directly. Essentially, the question is well, one we talked about a little bit earlier, which is to say, if APM users are coming into the web top, or this question is about authentication before they even make it to the web top, are we going to take some of that information, like their password, and pass it through bash and then possibly execute code in that way? And I don't know of any specific exploits for that. Again, it seems unlikely to me, but it's something we're going to have to investigate, and we'll take a look at that. I'll invoke the APM team later on today, and we'll have them take a look at it and see if they're doing anything. The way I know of the APM architecture right now, it is monolithic authentication, and so there is no inter-process communication, and that means bash is unlikely to be in the mix, but we'll do our verification on that one.
Thank you, Jeff. Yep. Yeah, and I want to reiterate that all of the questions from this session will be available on f5.com/Shellshock. And so even if we can't answer them for any of us panelists here, because obviously we brought a lot of breadth and depth to our panelists, but there are some instances that we have answers that we can't provide. But rest assured, we will be providing those answers on the overall landing page for each of you. So we will continually update those Q&A to ensure that you get all of the questions that you presented to us today answered for you. So let's see, we've got another question here. Does this also affect the F5 appliance in any way? And so I would suspect what they mean by the F5 appliance would be our chassis, our Viprions, or...
I think it just maybe the question is, are our devices susceptible? And I think you've covered that.
I think we've already answered that. Yeah. The status is that we know that this vulnerability, we're here today. We will be patching it, and we're working as fast as we can to get those patches for the appliances out. In the meantime, protect your management port. Don't allow internet access to your management port, and not through self IPs either. Excuse me.
Yeah.
Port lockdown is the way that works.
Thank you very much. All right, next question here from Lily. It's not quite Shellshock related, but since you talked about performance here, we are running 10 to 20% CPU and memory and have been pushed hard to add more servers behind F5. Normally, how much load you suggest is the comfort level for F5 specifically for a 6900? So I think that's a very, very vague question. If I could go ahead and just address this myself, when you're looking at every single system out there, 6900, it all depends on how many virtual servers, what type of load those actual virtual servers. So I hate to say this type of response, but it depends. It really it matters how many VIPs that you're running and what level of services that you're running on each of those VIPs, specifically to really get down to the detail of what's running on that 6900. I don't know if anyone else here wants to add any additional details, but I think it's very difficult to address without having more context to what's running on that particular system.
I get that question a lot. How much capacity can I have on this system? It depends.
Yeah.
You're right.
That's the awesome thing about F5 with the BigIP, right? We all know that we can run our WAF services with our application security manager. We know that we can run our advanced firewall manager with our our AFM type technology. We know we have global traffic manager that can assist with DNS and DDoS. I mean, there's a whole array of services.
How many modules you've got running? How much? Yeah.
Exactly.
There's
how many
throughput, and then there's CPU. We're limited mainly by those two, but there's
as
lots
you
of ways to juggle that.
As you mentioned earlier, what you're applying to your data path, right? Every time you add an additional service or you add additional, inspection such as an iRoll, we know there's going to add additional performance impact. So once again, to reiterate, it really just depends on what your environment is.
Do you think they can take a linear approach? They know how many servers they've got, and they're at about 20%. Can they safely say we'll triple that and we'll be okay? I'm not a performance guy, so.
I would suggest specifically for that individual to reach out to your overall F5 system engineer and have no doubt that he'll be able to dive in deeper into your overall environment and be able to provide you some more focused advice on that particular question. So moving on to the next question here. Can the issue pass on the remote script execution on other shared applications?
So basically, I think, let me frame this question. Can I, as a client, send Jeff the vulnerability and have Jeff send the vulnerability over here? Can it be something that can be chained across? That's how I'm interpreting that. And I would assume so.
Yeah.
If you're able to execute the vulnerability on a system, you could issue another web request to another system.
That is one of the dangers here is remote code execution happens from within your firewall boundary. So yes, in theory, if your application server, your web application server is vulnerable, and your backend application server and your database tier are all vulnerable, then yes, the attacker could hop from one to the other, and make it all the way through your backend.
And then they could pass information between them and back out.
Yes.
So let's just remember when we talk remote execution, after you've done the execution, you're no longer remote, right? You are now local on the system.
Yes.
So whatever that local system has access to, the individual that has those permissions clearly has an opportunity to exploit any other system that is in that particular security zone or that security boundary. So this is the whole purpose and reason why remote executions are so significant.
Yep.
And Jeff, as you talked earlier, why this one actually has so much broader and larger of an impact of what we were talking about with Heartbleed.
Right.
Due to the fact that once you're on that system, you can cause an immense amount of havoc within a particular environment. Like you said, you're basically going right through that firewall, and at that point in time, all those security boundaries have now been bypassed.
Yes.
So,
Patch. All the
Exactly.
systems you can.
and where feasible, implement other aspects such as the iRoll or line rate, or of course,
ASM.
if you have ASM's web application firewall, implementing the signature that we posted, or even by having default signatures in place, you're in a better situation than you are by not having F5's ASM WAF in place at all.
I think I read internally on an email from one of our ASM guys saying that some of the default signatures were catching these as well.
Absolutely, they
So,
are. Yep, definitely. All right, so got another question here from Jay. If the vulnerability is related only to authenticated users, what impact on an individual VIP are passing unauthenticated HTTP? So this specifically, and I want to reiterate, when we say it's only limited to authenticated users. I just want to make sure that we can delineate here, because we're talking about two different broad topics here. One being the ability to exploit F5's BigIP platform, and the second being our ability to assist you as a customer in being able to provide mitigations for bash vulnerability on other platforms and being able to provide that level of protection. So this specifically is a question about our platform itself. Jeff, if you want to go ahead and address this, once again, I'll just reiterate the question. The vulnerability is related only to authenticated users. What is the impact on individual VIPs that passing unauthenticated HTTP traffic?
So yeah, just to kind of recover that, the only vulnerability that we know of on the BigIP appliance is available to an authenticated user. They can come in and potentially execute remote code on the BigIP itself. That is, we have a patch in progress for that. That will be fixed sometime later this week. For traffic passing through your box, Joe has posted an iRule mitigation for that. We have ASM service mitigations, and the line rate product as well has a mitigation for traffic passing through the box. So two very separate issues.
And the point is, we don't know what app server, how the app servers are configured that you're passing through. It could be that the application, one of your application servers is sitting, the processing is sitting behind authentication, like our BigIP is, in which case you would need to be authenticated. But a lot of them we've seen, things I've seen posted are not. So unauthenticated users can come in to an application that you have to authenticate to get into, but the processing and the bash part of that happens in front of the authentication. So again, there's so many combinations of applications out there, and the breadth of this that's scary, that unauthenticated or authenticated users could be affected on the back-end systems. BigIP systems, from what we've known to this point, you have to be authenticated before you can trigger the exploit.
That is correct.
So is it safe to say, and correct me if I'm wrong here, gentlemen, is it safe to say that the management plane in itself has vulnerabilities to BigIP's platform, and they should be concerned with that, and that's self IPs and also, of course, the management IP.
Yes.
So, but when it comes down to the data plane is not vulnerable on the BigIP, but of course, protecting the data plane to other systems that are vulnerable is when you would use the iRule. So is that a good delineation? Management plane is that that's the affection, or is what affects our system itself, and data plane is any systems that would be outside of our control.
Yes, that's that we came up with these same issues during the Heartbleed. During the Heartbleed issue, it's very important to protect your management plane as well as your data plane. That's just standard terminology. Yes.
Okay.
Definitely.
So just want to clarify for all of you watching out there is that, of course, for the management type plane, for our self IP and our management IP itself, that is where you have to be concerned with our overall vulnerability, and you have to be an authenticated user. Once again, and Jeff, you said the patch we're working diligently on, and we'll be releasing it any day now. And then secondly, once again, for that data plane, this is where you can leverage the variable or the different options that we've discussed, which is the iRule option, the line rate option, or of course ASM leveraging our signatures. So got another question here from Graham. All of the recent vulnerabilities within LTM management are a result of the underlying open source derived HMS components. Is there a long-term strategy at F5 to reduce the footprint of the HMS? Wow. So I think this is an excellent question.
Sure.
And one that seems to be right in your wheelhouse, Jeff.
I will
Security.
take that one.
So
yes.
let's see what you got in your bag of tricks here.
In my tenure at F5 Networks, I have seen us add a lot of external third-party software. We regularly, within product development, we regularly have what we call threat model assessments. And these are meant to sit down and talk about, okay, you are adding new software onto the box. This is the purpose that it's adding. How can we make sure that we're not adding a completely new threat surface? I love the term threat surface because everybody pretty much immediately understands what we mean by a threat surface, right? If you have no services running on your box, you don't have a threat surface. If you install a standard distribution of, I don't know, the Ubuntu, actually Ubuntu isn't pretty good these days, but Ubuntu 10, you've probably got a whole lot of services running. You've opened up a large threat surface area. It's a great terminology. On the BigIP, we have many features that we've been adding over the years. You've seen all these features that we've added. We do add third-party software occasionally, and some of it's open source to add value to our customers. we have internal, I already said this, we have internal threat models that we use to evaluate that and make sure that we're closing off the box and that we are not exposing ourselves unduly. The funny thing about this bash one, this is where I'll editorialize for just a few minutes. If somebody would have said to me 2 months ago, you know, this version of bash we have, either it's old, it's actually not an old version, but something about bash, and they would have said remote vulnerabilities because of bash, I would have said that's probably not something that I really expect, right? Yet here I am today, and we're fixing this problem. So F5 will continue to do what we've done for quite some time, which is to try to evaluate the software that's coming onto the box and make sure that we minimize its impact. Another good point that we often talk about is having a crunchy exterior and then a soft on the middle. And a lot of times what we worry about is we worry about isolating this component from this component so that things cannot get through. And we also talk about those during our threat models.
Yep. And in addition, we're adding additional control functionality, such as being able to leverage Advanced Firewall Manager to be able to filter the management port, which wasn't available up until a recent version. So, you know, ensuring that you can, I mean, let's just reiterate, right? The management port in itself should never be on the internet. And we now also offer our network firewall that gives you the capability to do a 5-tuple restriction. So being able to ensure that you can restrict both the port and the IP address, which of course will, in the instance that you do make a mistake, it'll ensure that only the appropriate individuals are able to actually get to that management port, which is, you know, so following best practices around that management port is very, very important for all of F5's customer base. All right, so let's see here. Let's go ahead, let's get to the next question here. Where do we get the patched bash source?
Sam, can you take that one maybe?
Are they talking about just from, you know, the bash?
I believe they're just mentioning the source.
Yeah, you know, probably from GNU would be if you want to get theirs. I mean, are they talking about our patched? I mean, we're just taking it from upstream and then just applying those. So for those who don't know, we're a CentOS, you know, Red Hat based. So Red Hat would probably be one of the best places to go get these patches if you wanted to take a look at them. I believe you can go directly to GNU and get their patches as well.
Yeah, I haven't looked deeply into that question. I believe Bash is maintained probably by the GNU Free Software Foundation. Red Hat has somewhat taken the lead on issuing these patches, and so they've had the most recent patches available. You'd have to investigate the repository for Bash.
Right. But of course, when it comes down to getting patches from F5, the best location to look is Ask F5. And also on f5.com /Shellshock, that will lead them to any additional information that they need as well. So we are the source, of course, for any patches from our own system. As it relates to getting upstream patches, we will make sure that we provide full detail on that, the answer, and add a little more beef to it as we move forward throughout the day. So next question here from Harton. Is the default port lockdown sufficient to protect a self-IP?
I'll answer that one as well. The answer is yes. We have taken great pains. I think we started probably around 11.2 to start to lock down our ports. Versions before that, if you had created a self-IP at the command line, I believe that it was, I might not be correct here, but I believe that the self-IP created at the command line had its correct port lockdown, but the one created in the GUI did not have correct port lockdown. We've since changed that, so if you've got a recent version of BigIP, the port lockdown is good, and port 443 does not go out. You can always test by running, a curl, or just try to log in on your self-IPs, hit HTTPS your self-IP, and see if it responds, and if it does, then lock your ports down.
Thank you, Jeff. All right, so we got an excellent question here, because we've been talking a lot about HTTP. But essentially, is this vulnerability only exploitable by HTTP traffic? Can this be exploited by FTP or any other type of traffic, for example? I know we've been hearing a little bit about DHCP, and even some SIP. So Sam, do you want to elaborate on?
Against the BigIP, no, we don't have any of those open by default. But like if you're running a service on the back end, recently, I think it was over the weekend, people had active exploits against SIP. But yeah, any sort of protocol that's going to take you know, some input, and if it's going to shell out to a bash program, you know, certain things might be put into your environment variable. In those certain
Untrusted user input
untrusted
specifically.
Yeah, that's clear. That's really good. Untrusted user input, if it gets put into the environment, the way this vulnerability works is before that script even gets run, it's executing those environment variables. So yes, other protocols will be vulnerable, but it depends on, you know, the application, how it was written, whether and what they were using. So
I think the answer is right now we don't know, because people are finding new vectors for this every day. And you know, we just don't know, and depends on which versions of the products, custom applications.
And
There's
some
so
of it
many.
matters. Some of it matters on the particular framework you're using. We know that it happens in SIP, for example, with some frameworks. We know it happens within some web frameworks as well, but we can't enumerate all those right here.
Yeah.
It's just too early to know how many of those are vulnerable.
Yeah.
And the
And, oh, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No,
but DHCP was another one, and that one's been proven to be vulnerable. ISC has actually put out, and I know for the BigIP, we have one. I don't know which version we went to, but a DHCP, or I'm sorry, DH client. For if you're running that, for normally people have that when they go to initialize their BigIP. It's turned on the management ports. It'll DHCP and IP address. Those are vulnerable. It's because of the ISC. So one of the recommendations is if you are running DHCP in some sort of virtualized environment or whatnot, go to a static IP address. Again, this is with DHCP, it's kind of isolated to your management or your localized network, but still, it's one thing to be aware of that go to static IP address if you're using DHCP.
And there's there's instructions in the blog posting that I posted Wednesday. I updated it sometime over the weekend. If you go to System Platform in the GUI, there is an option there for how to change from DHCP to static IP address. Again, this is very limited in scope. An attacker would have to be able to get onto your management port network in order to be able to exploit this. But this is this is a vector that we have found. And again, we will be patching this later on this week. It will come with the bash patch.
And I think something that's important to point out here is that the exploits that we've been seeing have been via the web. If you go to netcraft.org, you'll see that we now have over 1 billion websites on the internet, and a huge portion of these websites that exist out there running Apache. They're suspected to be, and I've seen various articles out there that speculate around 500 million potential devices that have been impacted. And if you guys recall, I know Jeff, you were on the panel with me, and Heartbleed, we were talking how big it was on 500,000 or 1 million type of individual devices. And so we're talking a significant difference between the how many types of devices are vulnerable, and the easiest ones that we're seeing out there are obviously the web accessible type devices, especially seeing how prevalent Apache that exist out there. So you just got to stay diligent on top of this, because as you had mentioned in the beginning of the session, Jeff, is that when you look at it, bash is a part of the core operating system, and it is a core function of how that operating system interfaces with a huge portion of the daemons and code, remote executable code that exists on that platform. So from FI's perspective, we really are focused on HTTP due to the fact that we're replaced in the network. But we also encourage you to talk to your other, security researchers and other security vendors for those other protocols that are outside of the areas that F5 would be responsible for protecting. So
I will point out one thing very quickly here. This is not necessarily limited to Apache. That's the most common web server, and we've been talking about that. But if you are using Nginx or any other web server that you happen to be using, the same vulnerability still applies. It has more to do with your backend framework, whether you're using CGIs or how you're using that, than it has to do with your actual web server.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeff, for clarifying. So, all right, another question here from Josh. Whether the patch is going to be in the form of a hotfix or an individual patch. I guess he's asking whether the patch is going to be in the form of a hotfix or an individual patch.
Right, I'll
Like
take
it was
that
for
one.
SSL
Yes.
of course.
As of right now, the plan that we have is to release hotfixes for individual versions. We are exploring to see if it was a feasible thing to do to actually issue, let's say, a binary patch for just the bash binary. That hasn't been decided at this point in time. It's been discussed, but I'm not going to make any commitments one way or another. Right now, we're working towards keeping as many customers as we can safe, and that plan involves hot fixes for individual versions.
Thank you, Jeff. All right, so let's see here. Next question. With stock LTM, can you create an ACL for access to a management interface via the self IP? Joe, do you want to?
I think that's a Jeff question. I don't want to give the wrong.
I know that you can off the management port. Again, I believe it's on the system platform page. You can create access controls to allow only certain people in through the management interface. I don't know. Just Sam, do you know off the top of your head? I don't know if it's possible through self IPs, because that's a port lockdown. You either turn the port on or you turn the port off. So I don't believe there's any ACL mechanism there, but I'd have to do a little bit more investigation.
There is if you're leveraging Advanced Firewall Manager.
Yeah.
But we'd have to validate on
Right.
the ACL lockdown specifically if you're not leveraging that
Right.
Advanced Firewall Manager, of course, with later versions as well. So
I-
that's
There are a
important.
few other mitigations here we spoke about just a little bit before we started. You could set up a forwarding virtual to forward onto your self IP, and there's other things that I don't think we have time or the technical it's too hard to explain on camera. But there are other things you can do to protect yourself.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right. Any eye rules to mitigate other types of traffic exploits then? So I guess if the question is, are there any other eye rules to mitigate other types of traffic exploits? The answer would be absolutely. We had a session on this when Heartbleed came out, and in many of these instances, if we find that we believe that there's exploits that we're in front of, and that we have an opportunity based on our contextual programmability, whether that be through eye rules or through line rates or through one of our other security technologies, then absolutely we believe that we are in an excellent place to be able to apply those eye rules. So, everything from Apache Killer, like I said, the Heartbleed, each of these that come out that are associated with protocols and applications that we are protecting, we have a very strong set of context that we comply to those vulnerabilities. But once again, it really depends on a vulnerability by vulnerability basis, right? Because I know with the Heartbleed, we were able to apply something surgically both on the client side and the server side, and that we knew immediately how precise we were able to be. With something such as this vulnerability, I know that we've gone through a couple iterations based on encoding, based on other stuff such as user agent, right? So there's a lot of variables in each of these vulnerabilities, but we believe by leveraging the overall context that we have within iRoles that we can address a lot of them. But once again, we're not trying to blow the ocean as a company. We can't solve every single problem that you have out there, but if it happens to be a core protocol or application, we believe that iRules are a very good option to be able to leverage. Joe, I don't know if you have anything that you want to add there?
And I'm trying to get at what the intent of this question is. You answered it one way. If the question was, do we have any iRules to mitigate other vectors of this same vulnerability? Right now, our solutions have been HTTP based because that's what the majority of we're seeing out in the wild right now. Things are coming in with SIP and some other solutions that are somewhat more isolated. They're not as prevalent as 500 million devices out on the internet. So right now we have not published, if that's where you're getting at with this question, but that does not say we cannot do that. As more details come in, if there's a simple solution or something that a large enough demand for providing a SIP-based iRule block, we have the iRule language has the capability of doing that. We just haven't published it yet.
And you bring up a very good point, and I know that we've done an excellent job of plugging the Shellshock page on f5.com, but I think very important for everybody on listening in is that Dev Central in our community, this is where we first saw the activity coming in, individuals inquiring about the post. I know, Jeff, this is where you first posted our initial response in regards to iRule, and I know this is, Joe, where you've also provided some updates. So,
well, the Q&A section, there's a lot of back and forth with folks sharing ideas on these things.
So do you want to just elaborate as well on any of the blogs and posts that we have that obviously if there's enhancements that need to be made, that we encourage you to become part of that community and to contribute to any questions that you want. I know that a lot of the enhancements that you've been making over the last couple of days have been specifically based on community feedback. Do you want to elaborate just on how to update or ask questions around enhancing your iRole?
So look at we've tried to isolate the various components. The LTM iRule is one post. We've got the line rate solution as another post, so that we can at least target questions and answers and specifics for those. We have Jeff's blog is a great representation of F5's overall stance for a platform. So definitely look at the articles that we've written and follow up. If you've got a comment, there's comment sections down at the bottom. We also have our online Q&A where there's already a lot of active questions banter going back and forth. So check those out as well. That's a good place. You can ask us a question, but the Q&A is great for asking everybody else out there. And obviously, if you're in a specific situation, I always say this, it takes us time to try to reproduce it, whereas we're at 160,000+ users on Dev Central. There's odds are somebody else monitoring that who's in a somewhat similar situation as you. So we like to be part of it and build that community. So comment on articles if you've got feedback, but definitely look at the Q&A sections as well.
Thank you, Joe. And just to reiterate, this is an evolving vulnerability. As we know, new exploits are coming out daily. You find out a new exploit, ensure that, don't assume that, the community itself has already seen it. Get actively involved in the community. Get out there and ask the questions, because you'd be surprised. Your question may be very unique, and it may be the question that encourages us to take a different look and come up with a new type of mitigation. So please get actively involved in any of those threads that we have going on f5.com/Shellshock. So I know we're getting close to the end of our session here. I think we've got about 10 minutes. We're going to go ahead and take any last-minute questions that we have from the overall community and from all of you participants. So please keep the questions coming in if we haven't addressed anything that is specific to your type of environment or specific to how F5 can assist you either in mitigating the overall vulnerability to the platform or in mitigating to another type of system that's vulnerable within your environment. So let's see here. I think what was being asked was, for example, protecting a pool member against Shellshock on a non-HTTP traffic VIP, such as FTP, etc.
And
So that was the point I followed up
Yeah.
with. Yes, we have not at this point. We just don't have the details and a way to reproduce and test that scenario. If you, as a customer or as a user, have come up with a solution, please share with us. We will review it and share it out as well. It's great. The question and answer place is a great place on Dev Central to post those types of things. But as of now, we just don't have enough information to provide something that we can verify as a solution from F5.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so another interesting question here, and I know that a topic that was brought up at the end of
take
last
this
week, and one that I know we have the whole team actively working on, and we know this one is going to go directly over to Joe, but let's go ahead and ask it here. Why are the sample mitigation eye rules not using the decode function? Is it not needed, or is it forgotten? Joe?
I actually have a parallel solution in iRule that uses the decode. It's actually the question came up whether do we need to support base64 encoding, URI encoding, hex encoding, octal encoding, and all of these. And we spent a lot of time. Our goal with providing a solution like this is to provide something that's simple enough, least impact enough, with broadest applicability. We have yet to be able to reproduce in-house or the ability of passing encoded values through and having those being exploitable in the back end. If somebody can give us that an example and a way to reproduce it, I've got the iRule to push out, but we don't want to put a solution out that causes, encoding and decoding is costly. And doubling the CPU processing for an iRule when it's something that we haven't verified that it actually can be something that can be exploited is not a good thing for anybody. So I've got the iRule. If you want to see it, post a question and I'll post the encode a solution with encoding. If you have a reason to believe that you've seen this vector happening with encoded values, pass that through as a comment to my article, the mitigating Shellshock with BigIP iRules. Put a comment in there and let me know. And if there's some way we can reproduce it, I can put it out. But we did not exclude it on accident. We actually had a pretty big discussion internally about it.
Yeah, we did a lot of testing around this, and most of the encoding, we were seeing was being passed back to the environment variable.
Yeah.
And so that actually stopped the exploit there by putting in the encoding. But that's not to say that some other application may take this and then try to decode it and then pass it back on. But by default web server behavior, we weren't seeing that. I mean, that actually just gets passed back on because of the way the headers and the HTTP protocol work.
It's very easy. You just wrap the header value in the iRole with a URI decode. That'll give you URL encoding. Typically, the problem with encoding in headers is that the application needs to know about it. Web servers typically don't manipulate header values before they get to the application server. It's the application server's job to understand that. A typical header that does encoding is the authenticate header with base64 encoding. And I tried various forms of passing encoded values with base64 through as an authentication header. I could not get it to reproduce that way. So we haven't published it because we haven't been able to reproduce it.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, right? I mean, I know Brandon on my team was involved with you guys in testing and validating, and I know as of Friday, and I know the world has changed over the weekend, but all the active exploits we went through and tested all the various exploits and validated the ability to do encoding. So as of now, we just need to, as more exploits get identified, we will of course continually test these and validate these. But once again, if anyone can bring up something around this encoding and options, we encourage you to provide us that feedback. And we will quickly pick that up and test and validate, and if necessary, or as necessary, make the enhancement to the current set of mitigations that we have available.
Yeah, we're constantly testing, and one of the rules that we kind of live by is, attacks, never get harder; they always get easier. So, we want to, that's why we're always doing our due diligence. Just because, right now we can't prove it. There might be an application out there that is vulnerable to that. So we want to make sure that we have these iRules available to help protect those customers.
That's an excellent point. All right. So, all right. Let's see here from a question coming in specific from Rimco. Why are the sample mitigation iRules not using? Oh, that's
we just did that one.
We just did that one.
No more questions.
So, from what I see, we don't have any additional questions on there. I'm going to go ahead and just do a little roundtable here, and if we've got any last-minute urgent questions that come up here, of course, I'll pull that back in just to ensure that we address it. But if there's any other questions that come on after the fact, keep them coming in, and we promise that we'll be diligent as we can in addressing all questions that pertain to the overall BigIP platform, and also how we can help and assist in mitigating exploits via the data plane into systems that are behind us that we can help protect. So let's just go ahead and go around the table one more time and provide the audience any last minute tips or advice that each of you would have in assisting, of course, knowing that the story is evolving, the vulnerability itself is evolving. F5 will continually come out with additional information, and we'll bring that to our customers as quickly as we can. But in addition to that, Jeff, what are your final thoughts?
So we sat here a few months ago and discussed Heartbleed, and inevitably there's going to be comparisons of this one to Heartbleed, this Shellshock to Heartbleed. The old Chinese adage or proverb about "May you live in interesting times" has been very interesting the last couple of months. I didn't think I would necessarily have this many vulnerabilities in the year 2014, but here we are. I think some of the takeaways for this is are isolate systems when you can. In this example, you've got remote code execution on your web server under the name Apache. Well, what happens if that server is able to execute things? Can he go and raise his privileges from the Apache user to the root user? Can he escalate privileges in some way? You can isolate these things, and you can set, if you need to, you can set ASM between each of your tiers. You can put a BigIP between each of your tiers and be able to eliminate these vulnerabilities. The other thing I would say is some programmability in those devices. You've got all these expensive, good devices that will sit in between your layers of your network. How can you make sure that everything goes correct? And I think being able to have the iRules for programmability, being able to use the API like Joe talked about to be able to change many 1200 VIPs at once, these are all powerful aspects and that will prepare you to better be able to handle these things. And we're trying as hard as we can to know about vulnerabilities and track them and be aware of them, but again, I wouldn't have expected this would come in bash. So.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah.
Sam?
Yeah, no, that was this was a little bit of a surprise, the bash. So I guess the one thing I'd probably say is, I mean, I know we talked about security of the BigIP and you know, the servers behind that, but putting on my pen testing hat, you know, patch everything. And I mean, as customers, don't just look at the BigIP and the servers. We can definitely use the BigIP to help protect, you know, those backend servers, but you know, bash is everywhere. You know, patch all your systems, take a look, and as we saw with Heartbleed, I mean, as more eyes got onto the OpenSSL code, more vulnerabilities and or bugs were being found. I kind of suspect that might be the case here with bash. Now people are starting to really look at this code that's, you know, been around for a while. I wouldn't be surprised if you know, more stuff. You know, like I said, you know, 2014 has been a very interesting year. So, you know, that, and just keep checking back on, you know, both Dev Central and our blogs for updated iRules. And if you have any questions, reach out to your F5 representative. And you know that information gets back to both, you know, Jeff and I and this team. So if you have any questions, you know, let us know.
Thank you, Sam. And Joe?
So the main point I'll get across, and actually you brought up something in the back of my mind, we talked about Pruitt, but as you're getting into virtualized environments now, make sure all your system images that you're creating new systems from are patched as well. Because we've got, everything's out in the cloud, all of these servers, I want to spin up a new web server. If the origin of that is still vulnerable, then it's going to be an ongoing problem. So patch. Now's a good time for inventory. Look at all those old systems that have been lying around and make sure you know everything that's, and you had said that, how many, 20 years of different versions of operating systems and bash, and it's every version of Unix pretty much. So this is very pervasive. So don't take it for granted. Do what you can to block in the network layer, but definitely make it a high priority to get those systems patched. And then any updates that you apply to those or source images, make sure those are patched as well. So patch.
And I would suggest one thing. One thing my team did was we actually created unit tests right into the framework. So now I know every single version of BigIP will fail if somehow we regress, right?
Yeah.
I can't say how that would happen, but if somehow we were to regress and use an older version of bash by accident, we've got automation tests that will catch this, and so it shouldn't happen again.
Yeah.
Yes, you can implement automation as well as implement automation as well.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate all of you panelists taking the time. It's been an excellent group of panelists today, and appreciate everyone in the audience for investing your time and listening in. I mean, F5, we're here to be, to provide you the necessary information to ensure that you understand how to deal with an attack or a vulnerability such as Shellshock. I would love to say that, we're not going to see another vulnerability for some time like this, but if I would have said a comment like that 2 months or 3 months back on Heartbleed, obviously I would have been eating my words here today. So the way of the world is a little bit different than what we've seen in the past. As I mentioned earlier, we have over 1 billion web apps that exist on the internet now, and this has become a major vector for all exploitations. And we believe that F5 is in a very strong place in your network to be able to assist you within these overall mitigations. And we encourage you to take a look at our capabilities within iRules and our capabilities within line rate, and also our capabilities within our web application firewall, being able to provide very advanced mitigations. But additionally, we also encourage you to ensure that you stay up to speed on vulnerabilities as well to our own platform. And we'll, as we stated, we'll be providing you updates as the week goes on, as soon as we come out with the necessary patches. Just to reiterate one more time, f5.com/Shellshock will give you all the necessary information that you need. Thank you very much for your time today, and we look forward to talking to you again in the near future.